Of the four mediums of film, stop-motion animation is by far the one that's been the least used, and considered by many to basically be obsolete outside of artistic expression. But that being said, when looking at the few movies that are still made with stop-motion animation, one might find an overwhelming majority of them are actually considered to be very good and well above average compared to their CGI and traditionally animated counterparts. And though at first this might seem rather odd that such an outdated technique seems to keep consistently yielding such great results, it actually makes much more sense when you stop and examine just what makes stop motion so different from the three other mediums of film. But before we get into it, I would just like to warn you that there might be minor spoilers ahead for a few movies in this video, so in case you plan on watching anything, you might want to be on the lookout. Okay, so, just for a quick history lesson, stop motion animation was used for almost 70 years as the primary method of bringing 3D creations to life that would have been impossible to by any other means. Such creatures as King Kong, a skeleton army, and Medusa were all brought to life using this technique before CGI made it cheaper and easier to do. But between the success of Jurassic Park and Toy Story, stop motion fell out of favor almost overnight and was swiftly replaced with digital effects, with the technique after that really only being used in either feature-length movies or, in very rare cases, if an animator wanted a particular effect to have a retro or different quality to it. With that being said, let's take a look at a few movies that have been animated entirely or almost entirely with stop motion since the 1990s. And you'd get such classics as The Nightmare Before Christmas, Chicken Run, Wallace and Gromit, The Curse of the Were-Rabbit, as well as all the classic Wallace and Gromit shorts, Corpse Bride, Fantastic Mr. Fox, Coraline, Paranorman, and Isle of the Dogs and even lesser known but nonetheless still considered good movies such as James and the Giant Peach, Frankenweenie, Shaun the Sheep, and Early Man, and I'm sure a few others I'm forgetting as well. Now, my point here is none of these movies are considered bad. Now, compare that with CGI and traditionally animated movies. About 10 or 20 are released each year that are considered simply abysmal, having been released simply because the people behind it are just trying to make a quick profit, usually by trying to capitalize on the success of something else. And this has been going on since approximately the 1980s. Now, at first glance, one might argue that stop-motion animation's unusually high ratio of quality content simply comes down to the fact that so few movies are made with the technique anymore, so it only makes sense that the few that would be good. But if anything, the opposite is more likely to be true in a case like that. Now, keep in mind I'm no expert in these matters, but from everything I've ever seen, when a certain technique or style falls out of favor in the movie industry, usually the last uses of it are pretty bad ones, usually because it's only being used at that point by either desperate people or guys who don't truly understand how to use it. And of course, another argument is that almost all the other mentioned movies have some extremely talented people behind them, such as Henry Selick, Peter Lord, Nick Park, Tim Burton, and Wes Anderson. And while that's most definitely true, and probably a huge reason why those movies are so good, I believe there is also another reason why even the worst stop motion movies are usually considered average, with very few actually being thought of as bad. And simply put, it comes down to the method itself. Because, as you probably already know, stop motion is a very tedious process. It literally involves moving a model or models very slowly, barely even a quarter of an inch before taking a picture, and then moving it a tiny bit more and taking another picture and basically just repeating this process until the scene is over, and then moving on to the next scene and repeating it until the movie's over. Oh, and if you screw up, depending on how bad it is, you might have to start a shot all over again. And on top of that, every single frame of the movie has to be storyboarded, unlike in other animated movies where they can sometimes skip over certain sections, because there must be absolutely no risk of an animator forgetting to animate something while filming a scene. And let's also not forget that everything in the movie must also be built, from all the models to the clothes they wear to the backgrounds and props they'll interact with, and meaningless background objects that serve no purpose other than to make it feel more authentic. Which is another reason why they must storyboard the whole movie in advance, so that the people in charge of building everything know every last little thing that must be made for it. And I'm sure there are other things about the production process I could mention here, but I think you get my point. Basically, making a stop motion movie is hard, tedious, and extremely difficult. It's not uncommon for them to spend 1 or 2 years just in pre-production before filming even starts. And when it finally does, it can easily take up another year of time as well. And while it's pretty common for movies to spend years in production, when not counting troubled productions, stop motion movies tend to last even longer than most other kinds. And considering how fluid they've managed to make them look these days, that only tends to imply that even more work goes into them in order to achieve that look. So what I'm getting at here is the reason that I believe most stop motion movies tend to be considered good and have an impressive ratio when it comes to overall quality is because of how difficult it is to actually make them. It isn't like other forms of animation where you can just make and release them cheap and easy. It needs proper time and attention. Now, sure, some TV shows manage to make them more on the cheap side, but let's face it, a 20-minute TV show is just not the same as a feature-length animated film. Simply put, stop-motion animated movies are a massive undertaking, and the movie industry knows it. And considering they also believe stop motion doesn't attract much of an audience anymore, if they're going to invest a ton of their money, time, and best animators into one of these kinds of movies, they're going to make sure it's good. In other words, I feel like whereas other forms of animation can get away with being made cheaply or can afford to fail if it comes down to it, stop motion doesn't have that same luxury because they know the work, effort, and resources going into it. So I feel that most people wouldn't make one in the first place unless they're sure it's going to be worth everything. And this might also explain why very talented individuals are seemingly the only ones making these movies anymore, because the studio heads want to ensure its quality as much as possible and won't trust just anybody with them, unlike other kinds of movies. So to sum it all up, stop motion animated movies have an extremely high ratio when it comes to quality content, and even the worst ones out there are generally considered nothing special as opposed to being bad. And I believe the reason for this is because most studios understand just how hard it is to make them, and thus want to ensure that it'll return what they're putting into it by having it be the best movie it possibly can. And will only have people who've already proven their merit oversee their production. But I also believe that stop motion has a specific charm to it that other forms of animation just can't have. Look at those old Christmas specials from the 60s and 70s. Even with their more low-budget animation, they're still watched and beloved by millions at Christmas every year. And once again, I believe this mostly comes down to the fact that their stories were actually good regardless of their choppy animation, as well as putting that full stop-motion charm on display, bringing three characters and creatures to life in a way that only stop motion can. In other words, stop motion, in my opinion, still has its place in cinema, as shown by its consistently delivering on quality content, and that it might have a more universal appeal than studios seem to believe it does. Okay, I think that's everything I have to say on that. So now I want all of you to tell me, why do you think stop motion has much more consistent quality content than other forms of animation? Or do you believe it doesn't and that I'm wrong about everything I said in this video? Please feel free to tell me in the comments. And like usual, it's okay if you disagree with me. I have no issue with you if you do, as I understand that quality can be a very subjective term when it comes to movies. And thank you all for watching. I appreciate all of it, and I hope to see you all next time.